After so much hype and excitement leading around this camera, I'm happy to finally have it in my hands. Let's go through how I set up each of my cameras whenever I get a new one, and I'm going to give you some of my first impressions on how I feel about this camera so far. Some good, some... well, let's put it this way. Here are all the batteries that I've been using in all of my Canon cameras for the last 10 plus years. And now I have the R5 Mark II. Yeah. We're gonna have to talk about this one. Let's rewind. Let's open this thing up. Let's take a look at how I set up all of my cameras whenever I get a new one. Now, if you haven't seen it already, I'll link a video up above for you. I've already done a video with my R5 of all these settings I like to change. Now, the R5 Mark II has some additional settings I'm gonna go over today, but if you want another video that goes a little bit more in depth on why I change each of the settings, go ahead, check that out. So right out the gate, I don't shoot just JPEG, I shoot RAW plus JPEG, but I shoot RAW to one card and JPEGs to another card. So in order to get these features, we have to enable something else before we will see it pop up in our shoot menu. We're gonna have to go over to the file/card settings, which is that little yellow wrench at the top. We're gonna click on record function plus card folder select. Then we're gonna go down to the second option where there's a picture of just the camera, and we're gonna switch it from standard to record separately. Then when we go to our shoot menu 1 and go to image type/size, we can pick which image is being shot to which card. Now personally, what I like to do here is shoot the JPEGs to the CF Express card and then shoot my RAWs to the SD card. I've mentioned this in other videos. I shoot to smaller SD cards because if I'm going to lose a part of the day, I'm only going to lose a small part of the day. I like to frequently switch out my memory cards throughout the day. From a workflow standpoint and a financial standpoint, it's just easier doing it this way. So you can do it if you want to. If not, do whatever you want. It's your camera. This is what I do. The next thing I'm going to do is the user picture profile. Again, this is just a personal preference. Because I am shooting RAW images, this doesn't matter at all. This doesn't get applied to RAW images. This only gets applied to JPEG images and what you see on the back of your camera. Now, I want to see on the back of my camera as close to what the RAW image is going to look like as possible. I don't want an image that has contrast and sharpening and saturation already applied to it. I want to see what information I have there in the image. So I like to shoot a pretty flat image that I get to see on the back of the camera. So I set up my own user profile. I turn the sharpness strength all the way down because I don't like this artificial sharpening. I want to be in control of how much digital sharpening is applied. I turn my contrast down to help me see what's in those shadows and those highlights. Do I have detail there? Good to know. And everything else I leave the same. And that's my personal preference as far as a picture profile. For the color space, we're going to switch that over to Adobe RGB, just so we have a little bit more color. As far as shutter mode goes, a general rule of thumb, if I'm outdoors, I'll shoot electronic shutter. If I'm indoors, I'm going to shoot mechanical shutter, especially if I'm using flash. Now, with some of the initial reports that I've seen, this is before I've done any of my own testing, I have heard that the mechanical shutter has slightly better dynamic range than the electronic shutter. I don't know how true it is. I'm going to have to test it out myself. I'm not going to do a super in-depth testing. I'm going to just take some pictures in the same spot with different shutter modes and see what it looks like. If I can't really tell a difference, then I highly doubt my clients will. So I'm not too worried about it. But I'm going to check it out for myself and see if I can actually see a difference. Because often we're zooming in these pictures to 100% for no reason. Nobody's ever going to see it. Most of the time it doesn't go further than social media. And to be honest, no one's going to be able to tell if you have a half a stop of dynamic range more in one image versus another. So let's relax a little bit. For the people that are getting crazy about this in the comments of some of these posts that I've seen online, they're probably not even buying the camera anyway. They're probably Sony shooters or something, because to be honest, if you know you need this camera, you'll probably buy it. If you are up in the air about it, maybe it's useful to you. But for the most part, the people who are commenting on this stuff, they have no interest in buying the camera at all. This setting I love to change, release shutter without card. I do not want to be able to use my camera if there's a memory card missing. There has been times in the past where I go to pick up my camera and take a picture and I can't, and I'm like, oh yeah, let's put a memory card in there. And if you didn't have this setting enabled, you just be clicking away, and then when you go to look at the picture and say, oh, forgot to put a memory card in there. That's a problem. It happened to people before, and it's not fun when you're dealing with very important shoots. Now in the shooting info display, I get rid of everything that doesn't really matter to me because I only want to see the stuff that pertains to me and what I'm doing. Now this might change for you and the way you use your camera, but this is what I do. I skip over the first menu, I go right to the second. I'm going to turn on the histogram here and the level so I see everything. Then I go to the third menu, and all I want to see here is the histogram, so I'm turning everything else off. My fourth menu, I leave the same. Fifth menu, I leave the same. And sixth menu, I just turn that off. As far as my viewfinder info, the only thing that I change is the second menu. And I turn on my histogram, and I turn off all the other information. I like having that screen where it just shows the histogram. Now another thing that I do is I turn on the grid. Not because I want to play tic-tac-toe or because I don't know what a good composition is. It's pretty much just because I have a terribly difficult time holding my camera straight. I use the horizontal lines in there all the time to just make sure my horizon is nice and straight. It just saves me a couple minutes in post-production for every image that's just slightly crooked. Once in a while, I'll change the viewfinder brightness and forget that I did it because I was outside shooting on a really sunny day, or I wanted to show somebody a picture on my camera. And when I show people pictures on my camera, I tend to turn up the brightness so they can see the picture a little bit better. So just in case I do that, which happens once in a while, I turn on my histogram. Also because I don't always believe my camera's meter, I like to look at actual factual information in a histogram and make sure I'm getting a good exposure. But I don't like the default setting of how big the histogram is, so I make it smaller. This one's a little tricky because it looks like if you go to histogram display, it only says brightness, but if you click on that, it actually gives you the option to make the histogram size smaller. By just looking at that, you don't really see much information regarding the ability to adjust the size of it. Now the autofocus in the R5 Mark II is really what sets it apart from the R5 Mark I. There are so many options and things that you can change compared to the Mark I. And this is where the customization is going to be a little bit different from the R5 Mark I, but I'm still getting used to the camera. I've only had it for about 24 hours now. So I might change my mind on some of these. I actually recorded the back of my camera before recording this talking head scene you see right now. And since then I played with my camera a little bit in between, and I've already changed my mind on some of the settings that I did initially when I set up the camera. This feature I really like, the subject to detect, and I can put it on auto. Because I often take pictures of my dog and often my wife jumps in the scene too, it's kind of nice not having to switch back and forth between people or animal, and it'll just automatically detect. I'm really curious to see how it's going to play out as I start shooting more with both a person and an animal in the scene to see which one the camera favors. I'm going to guess human more often than not. The limit autofocus areas, I've already changed my mind on this a couple times. There are so many autofocus options for the R5 Mark II. I do not want all of them because when I cycle through them, and I do use a couple different ones throughout a normal wedding day or even a portrait session, I don't want to have to click through 12 different options. So I limit it down to only the ones that I want to use. One feature that is really nice on the zone autofocus, you can adjust the size of the box, how tall or wide it is, to customize how big you want that zone to be. I like this feature a lot. The way I set it up was I have one zone that's pretty small and almost doubles as spot autofocus, and then I have another zone that's really big. So if there's a lot of movement going on, it'll pretty much just capture wherever I have that box set in the frame. I always change the orientation linked autofocus point. It's really cool that when you go from shooting horizontal to vertical, if you have your autofocus point, let's say at the top of the screen, and you turn your camera, well, when you go to vertical, your autofocus point is still going to be at the top of the screen rather than where it was on the screen if you don't have this feature enabled. Now in the blue menu system, the only thing I change is in the third menu in the playback method, and it's underneath magnification. I like when I am reviewing an image when I hit the magnifying glass, it immediately goes to actual size. This way I can see if the picture's in focus. I hardly ever zoom into an image other than to check focus. And when I'm checking focus, I want it to be zoomed in all the way. That way I can really see if the picture's sharp or not. Other than that, I don't really zoom into the images when I'm playing back on my camera. One other feature that I might play with, but I haven't set up yet, is the blur/out of focus detection feature, which sounds really cool because your camera will just tell you if you suck at taking pictures. You don't even have to be good anymore. Your camera just lets you know. Underneath network settings, I don't really play with that too much. Occasionally I'll set it up to sync to my iPad, computer, or cell phone. But right now, there's nothing to customize in there. If you want a video on how to set this up, let me know down in the comments and I'll gladly do a video for you. Getting back to our yellow wrench section again, underneath the first menu, we have auto rotate. I keep it on computer. I don't like it on for my camera. When I see an image on the back of my camera, I want to see it as big as possible, so I do not have vertical images rotated automatically. I keep that function off, so it only rotates when I load it into my computer. Next up is the beep. If you watched my last video, you know I hate the beep. But this time, it gives us a kind of interesting option here. So when you shoot an electronic shutter on this camera, they play a fake camera sound. Kind of like if you take a picture with your cell phone, it plays this fake shutter sound. Well, now when you have electronic shutter on your R5 Mark II, it plays a fake shutter sound. Which at first I thought I really liked, and then I was like, not so much. But now I think I like it again. I don't know. I've had the camera for 24 hours. I've already gone back and forth on this 3 times. So we'll see if I ever actually wind up using this. But with that being said, it says beep. But if you disable the beep, it disables all sounds on the camera. So if you go to the next menu system down, where it says volume, you can choose which volumes the camera still plays. I turned off the one for the autofocus because I hate that beep that tells you, hey, yeah, your camera's in focus. I'm looking through the viewfinder, I see that it's in focus. But then you can adjust the sound of the shutter volume, that fake shutter volume, which is, I guess, cool. If you want to keep it kind of quiet, even though you're an electronic shutter, it lets you know audibly that you are taking a picture, which is nice because sometimes when you're clicking away on an electronic shutter, it's hard to tell if the screen flickered for a split second and if you actually took an image, or if you're looking at the numbers in the frame, you don't know if it actually took a picture. So the fact that we can have an audible option for when we're an electronic shutter to give us some feedback knowing that we actually took the image, it's a nice little feature. Thanks, Canon. Now this is a new part of the menu system with the R5 Mark II. Starting off with the custom buttons, I changed a lot here. So I'm going to start off going into my custom buttons, and we're going to start off with the photo features first. The first thing I like to change is the M-FN button, and I'm going to change that to enable my eye control autofocus. So I could quickly switch that on and off. I'm going to scroll down. The next thing I'm going to go to is the AF on button. I don't use back button autofocus. I'm going to change this to the whole area autofocus because I like having the ability to turn this feature on and off after playing with the camera for a little bit. And then for our little start button here, I'm going to change this to one shot and servo so I could quickly switch back and forth between those autofocus modes. Next up, they call it the autofocus point button. What I'm going to switch this to is the ability to switch between autofocus point types without having to hit a second button. By default, you have to push this button and then you hit the M-FN button up front by the shutter. And that's just an extra step that's unnecessary. So I like to just do that. You could quickly cycle through your autofocus points. Then for our depth of field preview button, I like to switch this over to the crop. Now I know when shooting RAW, it doesn't actually get applied, but while I am looking through my camera, I can see what the image will look like if I punched in a little bit more. And then for our set button, I like this new little feature that I found in here that temporarily turns up your screen brightness to max brightness, which is going to be really helpful if I ever need to show somebody the back of my camera in bright sunlight. Now into the video side of things. I'm going to set the M-FN button to custom picture. It just allows me to very quickly switch between different custom picture profiles I've set up. Scrolling down to the AF on button, I'm going to switch this to the whole area autofocus, just like I have in the photo mode. Next is the little star. I'm going to switch this to peaking, so I can quickly bring that up. Next is our autofocus point button. I'm going to leave that alone, just because that is the only way of switching the autofocus point. I don't understand why the feature that I have for photo to allow me to quickly switch between my autofocus points isn't also available on video. It's a weird little gotcha there. Canon, please fix that one. That's a simple software update. Then I'm going to scroll down to my depth of field preview button, and I like to set this one on zebras, so I can bring up my zebra patterns real quick if I need it. And last, for my set button, I want to set this to false color. You know, now that we have it in the camera, it's really convenient, and I could quickly turn that on and off while I'm recording. And that's all I do for the custom buttons. Next, I'm going to turn on the touch and drag autofocus settings. I love it when I have my camera up to my face and I can just take my thumb on the corner of the screen and move around my autofocus point. I do use the little multi-control joystick thingy back here, but having the option of just dragging around the screen sometimes is a little bit faster and it's just a little bit more smooth. So it's just another way of moving around your autofocus point. I like it. Try it out. If you don't, turn it off. And I set mine relative and to the top right, just so I don't have to stretch my thumb all the way across the screen to move that autofocus point around. And then our last menu for customized controls is the eye autofocus. And now this has been awesome. I've heard a lot of mixed reviews on this from the R3, but this was probably one of the features I was most excited about. So as soon as I got the camera, I opened it up and I turned on the setting and I wanted to play with it. And in the 24 hours I've owned this camera, I can see why so many people like it, but I can also see why so many people hate it, because I calibrated it to my eye with only doing one calibration. Didn't work that well. Then I refined it several times and it got much, much more accurate. I can autofocus with my eye so quickly now. I would love to be able to show you, but really the only way you're going to get to experience this is go to a store, grab the camera, calibrate it really quickly to your eye, and give it a shot. It works so well, I was shocked. I've heard people say that it works for them even through glasses. So maybe there's something there. It's just another way to move around an autofocus point. But check it out. You probably will be pretty impressed like I was. And the last thing that I do is I set up all of my menus. Now you can set up your menus however you want, but I like to set up my menus for the features that I use the most often. So I'm not constantly digging through the entire camera menu system, and I just have the things that I need access to and quickly, and they're right there. And I also group them kind of by like categories. So the first menu system is going to be the things I just use the most often. It's the things that I use almost every time I pick up my camera. And it's going to be format my memory card, check my battery levels, and a few other things. My second menu, now this is new to my R5 Mark II, is I'm dedicating to all of these autofocus features. There's so many things that you can do. My menu system 2 is now dedicated to autofocus. My third menu I would say is my miscellaneous menu. It's just a lot of random things, but I do like having quick access to them for when I do use them. And my fourth menu is going to be dedicated to the video features that I use most often. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room. And that's going to be this battery in this camera. I have owned this camera for 24 hours. Let me say B&H has some fast shipping because I've already purchased 2 more batteries. When this camera was first announced, they talked about how some of the features might be limited by which battery you use. And I'm thinking in my head, okay, I can't shoot 8K RAW without having the newest battery. Not a problem. I hardly ever shoot that. Well, it's a lot worse than that because you're limited to just 4K, 2K, and 1080 at 30 frames per second. That's it. You can't even shoot 24. I don't understand how 24 frames per second at 1080p is some crazily different format than 30 frames per second at 1080p. Why can't I shoot in these other settings on the older battery? You also lose a number of other features. You lose the ability to shoot high frame rates, such as 4K 120, which I can do in my R5 Mark I with this battery. But the second that I put it in my R5 Mark II, it says, no, we can't do that. Get out of here. You also lose one of the cool new features to shoot stills while shooting video. And then you also lose the ability to do the pre-continuous shooting, which it's a new feature, and I can understand that the old batteries don't work with that, but it's just another thing that is unavailable on the old batteries, and that's on photo and video. So unfortunately, while it looks like we had a good run with these old LPE6 batteries, it looks like they just won't make the cut for the R5 Mark II. Don't get me wrong, you still have access to a lot of the features, but not all of them. So if you're going to be picking up one of these cameras, you might want to order a couple batteries with it as well, especially if you're shooting video. Now, with that being said, I love this new eye-controlled autofocus. Like I said earlier, I think it works phenomenally. I can also tell that the autofocus, just in general, is much, much more snappy, and I feel like it goes right to it and locks on. I think that it is holding autofocus a lot better, and I think that it's a little bit more accurate, but time will tell. I do like that it has the vents on it now, so I'm going to push the record times and see how far I can push this camera. Will it hold up for an hour-long wedding ceremony? If I just take this camera and put it on a tripod and try and record a full mass wedding ceremony, do I have to worry about it overheating? Or will it stay cool with these vents that they added into the body? I can also definitely tell that the body is a little bit bigger. Personally, I think it feels a lot better in my hands because I have really big hands, so I appreciate the slightly larger bodies. For example, when I hold any of the Sony mirrorless cameras, I cannot stand it. I think they're way too small in my hands and I don't like holding them. I'm really excited to take this camera out, shoot with it. I have a couple shoots this weekend that I plan on using it on, and I'm going to be doing a lot of testing with this camera. If there's anything specific that you would like to see, let me know down in the comments. There's a ton of YouTube channels out there comparing this camera to other cameras from a more technical standpoint. I want to compare it in a more real-world application. So if there's something that you would like to see, let me know. And if there's enough interest, I'd be happy to record some of those videos for you. Now, to make this officially one of my cameras, there's one last thing I have to do here, and that's take a piece of gaff tape and put it right over the word Canon. Not because I don't like Canon. I love Canon. I love Canon cameras. I'll admit it. I'm a Canon fanboy. But it's because that little piece of gaff tape has come in handy on more shoots than I could count on both hands for the most random things. It is so useful keeping a few pieces of gaff tape stuck to your equipment, because one day in the future you're going to need to hold something, and that little piece of tape there might just come in handy. I really hope that this camera lives up to the hype, but only time will tell. Till next time, peace.